Kemet had long been in decline by the time the Greeks arrived, under Alexander in 332 BCE. The Nubians had been there, and so had the Persians. Alexander had already conquered an expansive territory by the age of 25, and Kemet was a shadow of its former self. After defeating the Persian king Darius III, he made Kemet his base, founding a city at the mouth of the Nile named in his honor. It was at this point the name Egypt began to be used. We're in Lower Egypt, about as far north as one can be in this vast country. Tommy's glad to be at the wheel after days as a passenger. This is the final road trip we'll be making on this journey. The destination, Alexander's capital in Africa, the city of Alexandria. But Alexander was not just satisfied with Kemet. He continued his campaign, driving farther east until he reached India and the Indus River in 326 BCE. His troops exhausted, he turned back to consolidate his vast empire, supposedly dying from disease. The year was 323 BCE. One of his generals, Soter, brought Alexander's remains back to Kemet, interring him at the city of Memphis in the Kemetu custom. There was dissent amongst the various generals in the regions conquered by Alexander. Soter became ruler of Egypt, establishing the 300-year dynasty of the Ptolemies in the process. Ptolemy would henceforth be the title of each male ruler, whilst Cleopatra was given to the females. But he wasn't accepted by the Kemetu, nor their Coptic religion, which only accepted rulers who were part of their spiritual system. So Ptolemy aimed to find a deity that would win the reverence of both groups alike. From the god Osiris and Apis, he adopted the image of Serapis, and with it, its cult. You see, in Kemet, people named themselves as Africans do today. The Yoruba will often have names with either the prefix or suffix of Oluwa, which means Lord or God. This is similar amongst the Igbos, who use either the prefix or suffix of Chi, referencing one's personal god, or Chukwu, the supreme god. Years of oppression followed as the Kemetu were forced to accept this new deity. Serapis's association with the afterlife made him become known as the Redeemer God and Savior. Centuries later, under Roman occupation, the Serapis image of Ptolemy I Soter would be used as the first image of Jesus the Christ, created over 300 years before the supposed real Jesus was said to have existed. Alexandria feels like any Mediterranean city, very different to Cairo and Aswan. It doesn't seem very African, nor should it be. Its proximity to Europe and Asia made it a prime location for conquest in the Old World. Soter was an avid writer of letters, and he founded the Museum of Alexandria, seizing centuries of Kemetu manuscripts in the process. The library was a center for research, and one of the greatest to exist at the time. It allowed many of Greece's scholars the opportunity to finally study the works of km.t minds like Imhotep, and author of one of the oldest books in human history, Instructions by Ptah. Only a handful of the books once housed here are still in existence today. The library was burnt down during the Civil War between the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar, his wife Cleopatra VII, and her brother Ptolemy XIV, around 48 BCE.
In Vienna.
We reproduced a facsimile of it, just a reproduction of it.
Okay.
Replica, and it's in the Manuscript Museum, if you're interested.
Manuscript Museum?
Yeah, it's a replica, it's not the original.
Okay.
It's a piece of papyrus with Greek writing on it.
Okay.
And some think it may come from the old life.
Okay.
That's all that is left to our knowledge of the old life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You've been very helpful. Thank you.
There is a bust of Alexander outside the library. It's conveniently facing his homeland of Greece. A man who conquered this land, but never came back to it. Kemet under the Ptolemies lasted about 300 years. The Greeks lost most of the territory they gained under Alexander. When Cleopatra's next alliance with Mark Antony failed, Kemet fully came under Roman rule when Octavian arrived with his armies at Alexandria. They remained in Egypt for 300 years, at the time Christianity was rearing its head. There was a split within the Roman Empire, a faction in Rome and another in Byzantium, or Istanbul today. Their empire, much larger than Alexander's, went as far north as Britain and across the northern coast of Africa. Rome had become too big to be governed by one emperor, and the religion of the Coptics was soon adopted by Constantine. With that, Constantine declared Christianity as the religion of the Holy Roman Empire. The km.t resented the imposition of Soter's image as Jesus, and there were other dissenting voices across northern Africa. Men like Arius of Libya grew large followings of people who rejected the image of Jesus imposed on them. To silence them, Constantine called the world's first ecumenical council, bringing together bishops of the Coptic Church and other clergymen to set the rules about their new religion. Using the Osirian drama as a basis, the 318 bishops met in northwest Turkey at a place called Nicaea in 325 AD. The Nicene Council decreed that the Serapis image of Ptolemy I was Jesus. They came up with the Nicene Creed to affirm Jesus the Son was one with the Father, as were Osiris and Horus. They decided on the day that Easter was to be celebrated, decreed all opposing texts to be burned, and that anyone with views other than their own to be struck off or anathematized, including Arius. Subsequent ecumenical councils were held. Each further enhanced Christendom to what we have today. Over 20 were called, the most recent being in the 1960s. They borrowed further from the Osirian drama. Isis the Mother was replaced with the Holy Ghost. They set the winter solstice as the birthday of Jesus. In the time of Justinian I, the first great church was built, with its completion date landing on the 27th of December, the initial birthday of Jesus. Years later, when the seat of Christianity moved to Rome, his birthday changed to the 25th. Ptolemy III, grandson of Ptolemy I, established the Serapeum dedicated to the image of his grandfather. It was here that the many scrolls from the km.t capital of Memphis were brought, and out of that came the Greek written language. Even with the ecumenical councils, many km.t and Greeks alike found it hard to accept the empire's newly adopted religion. The debate about the human nature of Jesus remained amongst the Coptics and their Byzantine patriarchs who ruled over them. The Serapeum was also the last stronghold of the Ptolemaic pagans who fortified themselves in the temple and its enclosure. Riots broke out in the streets around here, and in 391, nearly 70 years after the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, the Serapeum burnt down. The sanctuary was stormed by the Christians, and the pagans were driven out. The temple was sacked, and its contents destroyed. In bizarre irony, those who fought to maintain the Serapis image of Ptolemy Soter were themselves forced to accept the Christianized version of him. Very little remains above ground, except this enormous Pompey's pillar. By the 7th century, Rome had lost control of Kemet. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad, there was a power struggle for the leadership of Islam. The Islamic Caliphate swept in and took over the lands of the Romans north of the Sahara. They took Kemet, but not Nubia, which remained both Christian and indigenous in its beliefs for centuries. This Arab invasion spread north into Europe, in particular the Iberian Peninsula. They established great forts and citadels to control their territories. And with modern weapons and technology, they built on what the Romans, the Greeks, and the km.t had done. One such fort was the Citadel of Qaitbay, dating back to the 15th century. It overlooks the Mediterranean Sea. Only a few miles from the Serapeum, the Citadel is just one of many examples of the varying degrees of influence that can be found in Kemet's long history. The Arab-Muslim invasion was a bloody one. Many were slaughtered for their beliefs. It took the invaders 6 months to take the city of Alexandria in the year 641. Under a man named Cyrus, the city's walls and supply lines held out. But the Arabs were too much for them. After years of failed attempts, the Muslims were now clearly in control of Kemet, and their ventures south to Nubia laid the foundation for what would become the Arab slave trade of Africans in the east and the transatlantic slave trade in the west. A tax was imposed on the km.t who refused to convert to Islam. They were forbidden from building any new churches or synagogues, but still allowed them to practice their religions. In the 10th century, the city of Cairo was founded, making it a center for commerce and business. But it's here that many of Egypt's conquerors would fight their last stand. Constructed with solid rocks, Qaitbay housed soldiers and an arsenal of weapons. There's something eerie here, a cold feeling. Perhaps because of the many battles that have been fought. As I look out of this small window, I imagine the numerous muskets and cannons that would have been fired from here, or the ominous feelings the inhabitants felt as they saw their citadel being overrun. Not long after Qaitbay was built, the Ottomans invaded. Muslims themselves, they descended from the great empires of Persia who fought Alexander. They'd not long taken Byzantium, then Constantinople, and with that converted the Hagia Sophia from a church to a mosque. The citadel was in some ways built to defend against them. The Ottomans ruled Kemet from 1517 until they lost out to the British Empire during the First World War in 1917. Ironically, it was from Cairo that the British sent a young T.E. Lawrence across Sinai. There, he mobilized them into an irregular army, and they eventually took back control of the lands once held by them centuries earlier. There were other visitors to this land, marveled as I am by the mysteries of her monuments and the sophistication of her culture. Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt in 1798, at the height of the enslavement of Africans in the Americas. Many scholars up until then wrote about the greatness achieved by these same Africans along the Nile, whose descendants were treated as chattel in foreign lands. It was after this point in history that the Greeks became the authors of our educational system, when historically they were heavily influenced by that of the Afro-Asiatic groups of the Nile Delta. Religion has always been important in Kemet. The Old Kingdom was established due to the fighting between the North and the South. Ultimately, the North won, and out of that union came a unified God. Spirituality and science was the pride of its rulers, who made use of this magnificent terrain to create temples to their deities and monuments for their leaders. And as the years went on, many invaders came, some in awe, others with disdain. So-called Abrahamic religions have their origins in Kemet, and despite this being an African civilization, many seem to isolate it from the rest of the continent. Why then is it that the noses of most of her monuments seem to have been knocked off? Why is it that we ignore the primary sources of information who described who they were and what they were? Black. It may seem strange to name one's country after a race of people, yet we forget the many nations in Africa today who do just that, not by their own volition, but by those who invaded them. The same ones who deny that Kemet is the land of black people. In 2012, the DNA tests of the last of the Amena rulers were analyzed according to tribes. King Tut's was closest to southern Africans, followed by those in the Great Lakes region, tropical West Africans, the Horn of Africa, and the Sahel region. The same for his grandfather, Amenhotep III, and even Ramses. If this was really about truth, then the gatekeepers of so-called Egyptology would surely be interested in making this information known to the public. They didn't do it after the UNESCO conference of 1974, so we can't expect them to do so now. Whilst they deny the rightful heritage of the people of this continent, we too must deny the false history we're given in order to forge forward as a people. There is no doubt the last 300 years have impacted the view the world has of Africa and Africans. And as I stand here, high above Alexandria, I'm filled with encouragement at what its descendants can achieve, even amidst all our problems.
For 3 centuries, the story of Egypt has been written and curated by outsiders. And there's no better place than here at Alexandria to see why. Where the Nile River, flowing from its roots in Central Africa, meet the Mediterranean Sea, once the cultural and trading highway of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Here I stand in a 15th century citadel, and over there, Alexander's great library. 2,000 years apart, but now share the same residence. The people who first settled this land, from the beginning of the Nile to here, were not only of this land, but we're also wary about those same outsiders coming to claim this all as their own.
Kemet was and is an example to the African continent. It shows what can be achieved when we are free of outside influence and are able to think as we do. The sun might have set on ancient Kemet, but for us, behold, as we arise.